What's up guys, I've been away for a little bit too long, but glad to be back, so let's dive right into it. Today we're talking about Luminar 100. So I am a big fan of 100 speed films. I live in South Florida, where it is bright and sunny all day long, all year long. And although you don't get the flexibility and versatility you would of, say, a 400 speed film, where you might be able to shoot indoors and outdoors, there are a lot of perks that come with shooting a 100 speed film. If you shoot medium format film, you know that you're gonna have a much finer grain with that film. You have a bigger negative, so you have more information, and thus your grain is gonna be smaller in appearance, because you have so much more information to work with. With a 35mm, you don't quite have that luxury. Because your negative is so much smaller, the grain is going to be much more pronounced. As a general rule with ISO, both on film and digital, the higher you go, the more grain you introduce. So on medium format, you can get away with that more so the higher you go, again, because of the more information. But with 35mm, even at ISO 400, depending on the film stock, that grain can be very pronounced. So of course, with a lower ISO film, you're going to have less grain introduced, which for me personally kind of suits my styles and what I like better. I like to have punchy contrast with very clean, fine grain that has a very appealing look to it. It's enough to add good texture and give it that very warm film appearance without being kind of overkill. Again, this depends on your film stock and how you shoot it, and of course if you expose properly. But ISO 100 tends to just be a little bit more forgiving and just reduce that grain look overall. Luminar 100 is not a new film stock, unfortunately. However, they are very open about what it is, which I do like. Instead of having to guess and figure it out, they just flat out tell you. So Luminar 100 is just rebranded, recut, and respooled Kodak Aerochrome 4. They're also not the first company to do so. This is readily available from Kodak in bulk orders if you want to purchase it. Some other brands that do this are Santa 100, I think in Europe does this. Electra 100 also is rebranded Aerochrome, and also I believe Silbera is the same film stock as well. They all have the same kind of colors and looks and textures to them, which we're kind of going to go over now. So I shot 2 rolls of this, the first on my Voigtlander Promenade with the Nocton 50mm 1.5, and the second roll I shot on my Olympus OM with a Zuiko 50mm 1.8. I wanted to get 2 different cameras in there just to get 2 different looks, because I knew I was going to kind of favor whatever came out of that Promenade and the Nocton, just because I've really been enjoying that lately. No huge differences, but again, just wanted to mix it up a little bit. So you'll notice with this film, again, as I said, it has a very fine grain and it has great contrast. It's got a very nice warm tone to it that you would typically get from your Kodak films like Portra and Gold, but a little more subdued in the yellows and punchy saturation. And this stock is also known for having a little bit more punch and a little bit more brightness in the reds. Now personally, I didn't notice this as much, but I developed this myself, and I also DSLR scanned it myself as well. So depending on what lab you go to and what scanner they use, it might read that film a little bit differently, and you might get a little bit more punch in those reds, simply because it is a thinner negative, and depending on the scanner, again, it might have some issues reading that information because of the thin negative. But again, because I DSLR scanned mine, I had raw files to work with, and I had a little bit more flexibility kind of fixing those issues. I didn't edit these really, other than just straight converting them with Negative Lab Pro, because I'm taking a raw negative with this file and converting it. It tends to be a little bit more forgiving and kind of help correct any of those issues. So I didn't really notice anything too over the top with any reds. Skin tones tended to be a little bit more magenta, a little bit more pinkish, but nothing too crazy, but that is something to be aware of. Again, like Kodak Portra 400, for example, it holds up pretty well when under or overexposed by about a stop. If you go towards a 2 stop, 3 stops, of course you're going to notice shifts in color work. If you go past that, if you underexpose 2 stops or more, it is going to tend to lean a little bit more green, and of course as you get overexposed more, it's going to go towards the yellow, and those reds are really going to start to pop out with that. So Luminar is from a company called Pofo Camera up in Canada, in Montreal, and I'm happy they're making this film. Now, some things to note with this film, it is only available in 35mm. They don't have any plans to make it available in 120 as of yet. Hopefully, maybe that could change. They don't have any other films lined up yet, but again, hopefully with support and as people tend to get more and more into film and fewer options become available, such as Fuji and Kodak all removing films constantly. Maybe that changes. Hopefully we get some new tech or some companies that get more traction, get more business, and we can start developing films in those brands. So this film is loaded into reusable canisters, so that is also a plus. You can reuse it yourself if you bulk load. And also on that note, these don't have DX codes. So they are working on that, and they're gonna end up putting DX codes on this eventually. So if you have a camera that only works with reading DX, you're gonna have to hold off or come up with an alternative solution and print your own or something like that in order to use this film in those. So again, the reason I like using 100 speed films for me in South Florida, my favorite cameras tend to max out their shutter speed at about 1/500. I have a few that I like to shoot that go up to 1/1000, and then my f2 and f3 go to 1/2000, but mainly my shutter speed is gonna max out at 500 to 1000, which means I have less room to work with in my f-stop. So if I'm shooting outside in sunny South Florida, I'm probably gonna be at anywhere from an f5.6, f8, f11 if I'm shooting a 400 speed film. Now with a 100 speed film, I get a little bit more flexibility. So instead of maxing out my shutter speed and shooting at f8, f5.6, if I wanted to, I could drop down to f250 at 1/25 and shoot at that f5.6 to f11, or I can max out that shutter speed at 1/1000 and then drop my f-stop down and maybe shoot at something like an f3.5, maybe a 2.8 depending on the situation, which gives me more flexibility for working with my composition. Personally, I like to have that option. There's obviously a lot of times where I want to be able to shoot at f2.8 to f3.5, but then if I'm shooting a moving subject or if I just want to make sure I nail that focus, I want to crank up to f5.6, f8 and drop down my shutter speed. So when it comes to film, I personally like the 100 speed film for that reason. And again, because of the finer grain and just the contrast and things like that that I mentioned before. Yes, you could always put an ND filter or something on your camera, but for me, that workflow just works better to be able to go back and forth between those. So if you want to give yourself a little bit more room for creativity and be able to manipulate your settings a little bit, of course, depending upon what camera you're using and what your settings are available to you, maybe it's time to switch down to a ISO 100 film instead of the go-to Portra 400 with that flexibility. Yes, you might not be able to shoot indoors as much, but you're going to be able to play with your settings a little bit more in those outdoor brighter situations. And for that, I can highly recommend you check out Luminar 100. It's a great film. It held up well in overexposure, underexposure, and I really like the look and feel and just the crisp grain features of this film. If you have any questions about this film, anything else film related or anything non-film related, Fuji related or lens related, etc., feel free to leave that in the comments below, and hopefully I will see you again very soon.